Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Indie Game Friday, where each week I take a look at another independent computer role-playing game. This week's gonna be brief. I'm taking a look at one that leans heavily on pure nostalgia in terms of its composition, despite being a relatively new game. Developed and published by the Binary Initiative, Heroes Spirit was released back in December of 2020. Heroes Spirit is a top-down adventure-style game that mimics the style of the NES-era games, where RPG and adventure genre games were just beginning to get settled into their respective niches. As such, both presentation and gameplay harken back to that era, and in all honesty, it would probably be more an action-adventure game by modern standards than an RPG. I'll get into that towards the end. Still, it is strongly reminiscent of the primitive games of that era and does a fair job of fitting into that particular aesthetic. In terms of plot, the world is threatened by an evil witch. The local castle is closed off, buildings are in ruins, and monsters roam the lands freely. You set out to try to claim what power you need to foil the witch's sinister plans, whatever they may be. So yeah, something grabbed right out of the mid-80s to early 90s era storytelling to match the aesthetic that it's going for. Gameplay consists of exploring around the world, speaking with the various NPCs, uncovering clues, and defeating enemies. Along the way, you upgrade your character, pick up items to bypass obstacles, gems to spend on purchases, and generally work towards the goal of freeing the land from the witch's influence. Character stats, they're non-existent. I mean, you do have an attack rating, which is represented by the swords that you pick up, and a lives rating that determines how many times you can die, which is represented by hearts. It's more arcadey than RPG in this regard, really, and as such I firmly qualified it as an adventure game rather than an RPG. That having been said, the battle mechanics do make the live system somewhat more understandable in the long run. Rather than dealing and taking damage, combat is resolved entirely through a binary test. Each monster has a power level. If your accumulated attack rating is equal to or greater than that power level, then the monster dies. If the monster's is greater, then you die. Or you lose your shield if you have one. Dying returns you to either the last save crystal you touched or to the beginning of the area that you've entered, and can actually be used as a sort of quick teleport that way. Movement in the four directions generally allows enemies to take their turn after yours. If you aren't moving, the monsters aren't either. There is a slight movement rate difference, so you can outrun most monsters, which can help offset the instant death style of combat. In order to attack an enemy, you just walk into it. Likewise, to talk to an NPC, read a sign, pick up an item, open a door, crush a rock with the appropriate item, so on and so forth, you just walk into them. As you wander around, you can pick up a number of items. Swords increase your attack permanently, gold swords double your attack temporarily, shields block one blow, while stopwatches stop all enemies in place. Hearts increase your stock of lives, gems are gathered in order to spend at shops, keys are used to unlock the appropriately matched type of door, and so on and so forth. You can also pick up other things like boxes of treasure, items that can be used to overcome obstacles, etc., thus unlocking more of the map as the game progresses. Each map is a large tile-based map in a manner reminiscent of NES-style graphics. Maps can be linked to one another by tiles marked as transition tiles. The world spans a fairly decent number of these maps, being quite extensive, with the enemy selection of each particular individual map growing more and more powerful the further you go from the beginning. Graphically, the game presents itself as an NES-era style game, and I've mentioned that several times by now, but it is clear down to the fact that many of the tiles and sprites, I believe you can actually recognize which titles that they were either inspired from or, I don't want to say ripped from because they have been changed, but yeah, you can pretty much tell where a lot of these tiles got their basis from. For instance, the graphics for a lot of the individual NPCs look like they were adapted from Ultima Exodus and then given a little bit of a makeover, but not much. The music is much the same, with a sort of chiptune vibe and slight repetitiveness that was common for the era, although it's a little bit more original than the tiles themselves. I will say that it does a slightly better job in making the soundtrack less annoying than a lot of games that aim for that same vibe, although your mileage may vary on that. With its simplistic gameplay, retro-style graphics, and music, Heroes Spirit won't appeal to everyone, and even for people that it's trying to aim for, people who are fans of the 8-bit style RPGs during the era when the genre itself was just getting defined, even for those people, it may be hit or miss. I personally think it captures the look and feel of that era very nicely, although I will admit that I went into this game thinking that it was something just totally different. The tile set reminded me strongly of a few turn-based RPG titles from that era that I really enjoyed, and I went in expecting that sort of gameplay. What I got was something more streamlined that didn't really qualify as an RPG by modern standards, and yet I had fun nonetheless, a lot of fun. It was different than I expected, but not disappointing in what it achieved. However, Hero's Spirit is one of those games that highlights a certain question that I've had. Now, there is the overall general question of just what qualifies a game to be an RPG. That's easy enough to ask of a modern game. But the nuance is what happens when you apply the same standards of defining an RPG to old games or those games seeking to capture that era's design and aesthetics. In terms of modern gameplay, I don't think Hero's Spirit really qualifies as an RPG, and yet if it had been released in the late 80s to early 90s, I have no doubt that it would definitely have qualified by the standards of that time. And while I believe in judging a game either by the era it was released or by the aesthetic that it's so obviously trying to capture, I understand that others don't. So I'm not going to make that judgment call as to whether it's actually an RPG or not. I will say, however, that for a fan of old school NES and 8-bit era gaming, especially RPGs and quasi-RPGs from that time, Hero's Spirit is a solid little title in its own right that will hit a bunch of nostalgia buttons. It's like playing a new game for those platforms, and the price is reasonable at that. However, unless you're into that aesthetic and the retro gaming scene in general, you might want to give this one a miss unless you can catch it on sale. It is really fun, but, it's not going to win over any new converts. And on that note, I'm going to wrap things up here. As always, I will throw a link below to where you can pick it up. This has been the RPG Crawler with Indie Game Friday, Hero's Spirit. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you're still watching this far, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported this channel via Patreon or direct donations throughout the years, without which this channel could not have lasted as long as it has. For those who are feeling particularly generous, you can still support my work through Patreon and now through Subscribestar as well, through the links in the description below.